Well, here we are, another stop on the journey to finding hope, inspiration, and positivity in this crazy world we all live in. You are listening to Changing the Perspective podcast. If you are watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and like this video below. If you are listening on a podcast service, please like our podcast on your preferred service. No matter how you choose to hear this interview, we are grateful you are following us on this journey. New interviews will be released weekly and cover a variety of topics that all bring a situation of struggle that end in positivity. Maybe you can relate to an interview topic, or maybe you just need some hope and inspiration. Either way, enjoy. Hey everyone, welcome to another interview of Changing the Perspective. Today, something super fascinating that I never actually thought I would talk about on this podcast. And that is about school shootings and being a survivor of an intense, chaotic situation. So today we're actually talking with Taylor. I met her on, again, this kind of community of Facebook podcasting stuff. And she listed her story, and I was like, holy cow. And she agreed to be on. So I'm super excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll just let you take it away with your story.
Okay, sounds good. Well,
Get
it's good
started.
to see you, Shauna. As Shauna said, we met because we have a mutual interest. We are both podcasters, and
Yeah.
so I think there was a post in the group saying like, "Hey, like let's connect like-minded people." And I published my podcast on New Year's Day. So very recently, we're only, let's see, what day is today? Today is January 24th, 2021. So it's been out in the world for 21 days. And the subject matter of my podcast is the school shooting that I survived when I was 15 years old. And so Shauna said, "Hey, like let's have a conversation about that. That seems like an interesting story of overcoming." And so here we are. But essentially, my podcast is it's a fictionalized version of something that is very closely related to my true story. And when COVID began, I'd been talking about making a podcast for many years, and I'd never done it. And I decided like now's the time. But the weird thing is when I went to write the script, I realized that if I was going to tell the story of myself, and then the other perspectives are my mom, my dad, and my brother, I didn't know where they were that day. And so the very first thing I needed to do was to sit down with my family and say, "Hey, can you tell me your story from that day 15 years ago when the shooting happened?" And so we did that, and that was really interesting because I don't know that anyone has ever asked them. We never talked about it for whatever reason. And so they each talked for, I don't know, 6-7 hours, a long time. And because so what happened is that we all were in the, well, not all of us, that's not quite right. Start that over. That day, my mom worked in the building, so she was right across the hall from where the shooting happened. I was in a classroom that was right down the hall from where the shooting happened. And my brother was in the middle school, which is connected to the high school via the cafeteria. So he was also in that same building. And then my dad was about an hour and a half probably from where it was happening and couldn't get to us. So I
Oh,
think that was another very intense, different perspective of what it feels like to know that your family is in a very dangerous situation and that you can't get to them.
yeah.
So I sat them down, we had these conversations, and then I went to work to build my podcast. And the podcast is an audio drama, which means it's kind of like watching a movie, but you can't see the screen. And
Mhm.
so I recruited 70 actors to play all of these different characters from my past to tell the story. Because the kind of the point I'm trying to make with this podcast is that nobody makes it out of these situations unscathed.
Mhm.
We go through something horrible and traumatic, and it follows you for the rest of your life. And
Yeah.
I think people see this stuff on the news and they're like, "Oh, how sad." And then they just forget about it, and they don't
Mhm.
realize that these people are continuing to function in the world, but now everything is tinted through the lens of PTSD.
Yeah.
And I want to tell that story. I think that story is so important. And there are so many people in the United States who have been affected by shootings in schools. Unfortunately, there's been
Right.
300 and something shootings since Columbine.
Wow.
That is absolutely insane.
That is
And
insane.
right, I mean, I don't. I don't know. It just seems like crazy that, what happened to me was 15 years ago and nothing's changed. Um, Shauna, do you have kids?
Yeah, he's 19 in college.
Okay. Yeah. So you would know what that feeling was to, like, I suspect he probably had lockdown drills when he was in
Mhm.
high school, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I was talking to a group of people on a different podcast recently, and they were 22 and they
Okay.
had grown up having drills their whole
Yeah.
lives. It's just like part of living in the United States. And it's weird because like I never had a drill because Columbine happened in 1999 and then the shooting at my school happened in 2006. So there weren't any for like 7 years. And I think people were like, okay, we're in the clear. And then the one happened at my school. And then a bunch of copycats happened soon after.
Mm,
And then that kind of began the spiral that is where we are today.
yeah.
That you see this stuff on the news often, you
Yes.
know?
Yes.
I don't know. I can't
Now,
even imagine like as a parent what that would feel like
well,
to have
now
your
not just schools,
son.
but like sporting events and
Right.
movie theaters, like all these places that like your child could have been at any of those places, not even
Exactly.
school.
Yeah, and I think that is really strange that like
Yeah.
as a culture that you and I, when we go into a movie theater or a church or any kind of public space like
Right.
that, a festival, I think people are kind of like scanning the space to go like, where's my exit? And that's psychologically very disturbing that that is kind
Yeah.
of the world we're living in, but it is also the reality.
Right. Yeah. Sad.
Yeah.
It's sad.
Yeah, it's a bizarre and creepy thing. But would do you want to kind of go into the story of like what happened that day? Do you want to go
Sure.
into the story of like what it was like building the podcast? Where do you want to head?
I feel like let's start with what the story kind of is. That'll explain a little bit more about kind of where you went with your podcast and why you chose what you did and um, all those pieces.
Sure. So, the shooting at my high school happened in 2006. And before it happened, I never met the shooter, but rumor has it that he was kind of wandering around town. He was homeless. He was living out of his Jeep, which he had kind of parked out in the national forest, someplace where he wasn't supposed to be. And we didn't know this until after the shooting, but this is a man who was suffering from major mental illness. He suffered from bipolar 1, and that means that in his particular instance, he had really high highs and really low lows. So he was meant to be on medicine for this, but he would stop taking it. And that's what's happened in this instance. And so he was hallucinating. He didn't know what was real and what wasn't, which I can only imagine how scary that must have felt.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he was kind of just kind of around in town for a while before it happened. And I grew up in a very small town in the mountains. And, just nothing ever happened there. There was not it wasn't like a high risk place to be. Like people moved there because it was safe and because it was like, small town
Yeah.
life. And so, when it happened, no one knew what to anticipate. But anyway, that day it started off like a normal day. As I said, my mom worked in the high school, so I remember standing at her desk. I remember like writing a note to a friend of mine, a classmate, and handing it to her. And little did I know that my classmate was about to walk into the room where the shooting would happen. um, so I just walked off to my math class like any normal day. And the next thing you know, there's an announcement on the intercom that says, attention everyone, this is a code white situation, we need you to lock down. Well, none of us know what a code white situation
Right.
is. Like at that time in the United States, you didn't prep for that, you didn't plan for that, we didn't know what that meant. Our teachers knew what that meant, fortunately. But essentially the lights go off, they kind of rush you into a corner, they put papers up over the glass parts of the windows so that if someone's wandering around the building, that they can't see who's in what rooms. And then there's a a system in which you put papers underneath the door that are color coded that can tell the SWAT team whether or not the people in that room are safe. So our teacher would have done that. And during the actual shooting, he was in a different room than I was, so I could hear the gunshots. But it's interesting because in a really traumatic situation like that, different people have very different reactions, which is part of the story I tell in the podcast. Because the character that's based on me, I was kind of jokingly telling people like, it was just a door slamming. That's not a gunshot. It's not real, because that was my coping mechanism, was trying to convince myself and others that this wasn't actually happening. And then meanwhile, there's somebody like crying hysterically in the corner, as now I understand is appropriate. But at the time I was like, why is she doing that? And then there were kids making like really dumb, immature jokes because, they're trying to make it feel like it isn't real. And we were probably in that room for probably about 3 hours would be my guess. And during that time, like we didn't know what was going on. We could just hear gunshots and knew we couldn't go anyplace. And eventually, from what I understand, my classroom was one of the last classrooms to be evacuated, perhaps because it was like right down the hall and they were kind of saving that group of students last to get us out of the building. Anyway, the SWAT team came in and told us that we were gonna basically need to run down the hall, down the stairs, behind the school, and across a parking lot. And at that time, they didn't know if there were additional shooters parked out in the woods. So, we're running across a parking lot, not knowing if there's going to be somebody in our group that's taken down. And they ask you to put your hands above your head because they need to know that none of the students have a gun. And basically when they say go, you go. And we ran, and we got to the next building where there's kind of like a gym kind of set up where they were taking roll to see who all was there. And because I was one of the last rooms to be evacuated, by that point, like, we knew exactly who was still in the room. The shooter had been, he kicked out all the boys in the room and the teacher. And then he kicked out all of the girls who were not blonde. And then slowly but surely he whittled down the numbers until there were 7. And then by the time I was evacuated, I believe that there were only 2 girls left in the room. Okay. And so they put us on buses. And as we were getting put on buses, we watched a helicopter land outside the school. Because at that point he had shot my classmate and himself. And they took her via flight for life to the hospital. And so, as we were being evacuated, we didn't know whether or not she was alive. And by the time we got home, we had, voicemails from every news station in the world. We had missed calls from CNN and NBC and Fox and every news station that had called us, and we're watching on TV as they're saying that this young woman has been announced dead. And and it just, wow. I don't know, like, the event itself was so horrible, but then the aftermath in my mind was equally as horrible and just as important to discuss, which is why I've made this podcast. Because, in the aftermath, people didn't really talk about it. At least in my circles, people didn't talk about it. Yeah. And that's a really, really horrific thing to go through and then sweep under the rug and just assume that that everyone's okay. And I think at the time I thought there was something wrong with me because I was having such a strong reaction to what happened, and I kind of felt like everyone else was okay. And now 15 years later, now we're starting the conversation with this podcast, and I'm finding out that nobody was okay. We were all really struggling, but nobody talked about it. And so no one was saying out loud that, like, I need some help. Like, what's going on in my psyche right now is, like, it's not okay. And I'm concerned and I'm scared. Like, as far as I knew, I was like, I guess I'm just crazy.
Yeah.
And so in creating this podcast, I'm trying to tell the story of, like, yes, in the aftermath, people are affected, and this is what it looks like, and it can be really, really bad. And if you're a young person who's just gone through this situation, it's okay to seek help, and you're having a normal reaction to an extremely abnormal situation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of yeah, the purpose of what I've created, because people don't, I think especially parents don't know what it is that happens when a school shooting happens, and they
Right.
certainly don't know what to expect with when their child comes home and they're like a different person, because you grow up overnight and suddenly you're a different person. And
Mhm.
people don't know how to deal with that. Not that I have all the answers, but at least I'm trying to provide people information so that
Yeah.
they can make
Yeah.
the right decisions as to how to better parent, how to better be an advocate, how to better take care of themselves, how to seek therapy if necessary, that kind of stuff.
Do you feel like because the high school age and really the middle school being affected a ton as well, um, that age, you don't process and cope with things very well anyway.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, period. No.
Right. So then
Yeah.
adding this on top of it, do you think that the age made it worse because you didn't start with any coping skills? You weren't to that level yet, and now you've added even additional things to it.
That's an interesting question, because I think my gut instinct is that yes, you're absolutely right. And
Mhm.
at the same time, I feel like even the adults didn't know how to cope with it.
Yeah.
Nobody knows how to deal with a situation as extreme as a school shooting.
Right.
So yes, a teenager has way fewer coping mechanisms, but the adults didn't have good coping mechanisms either.
Yeah.
And the kids were learning by watching the adults. So
Mhm.
if the adults are, let me get drunk to the point where I
Right.
don't have to sleep, so I don't have to dream, so I don't have nightmares, then the teenagers are going, huh, should I use a substance to cope? Would that be a useful tool? And you can't blame the adults in the community for not having those coping skills, because who does? I think
Right.
after that sort of situation, you're all just like trying to survive and you're doing your best. And at the time, I think I was very frustrated because I'm like, I need someone to go to. But looking
Yeah.
back on it, it's like, like for any person at any age,
Yeah.
there is no roadmap for this sort of situation.
And everybody does it differently.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. That's been very interesting as I've released the podcast, to hear feedback from people who are from my hometown, because what I just said of like, you grow up in an instant, and for me, I felt like I was like suddenly an adult at 15, which
Yeah.
was probably not accurate, but that's how I felt. And it's interesting because other people have reached out and said that they kind of had this weird, like, kind of backpedaling thing happen in their brain where they felt younger than they really were.
Mm.
Because maybe they were trying to grasp on something that is like innocent and young and silly and childlike.
Mhm.
So I think that you're right on the money there. Everybody copes differently.
Mhm.
And my story is not like a perfect representation of how everybody dealt. I
Right.
try as much as I can to represent lots of different perspectives, but you're right. There is no one size fits all solution in this sort of situation.
Yeah. Being from a small town and this happening in a small town, do you feel like you were tied between having to start healing as an individual and start healing as a town because it affected all of you as a small town unit? You get very close to everyone. Everyone knows everyone and everybody knows everybody's business. That is like the
Yep,
typical
yep.
small town mentality. And so do you feel like you had to deal how or learn how to heal yourself and heal with the town at the same time? And if those ever like contradicted each other?
Honestly, I don't think either one happened, which sounds
Okay.
crazy, but like, I think on an individual level, people did not try to heal or seek
Okay.
help. I think it's been interesting now, 15 years later, having conversations with people, because some people are choosing not to listen to the podcast, period, because they're like,
Mm,
you know what? I learned how to put that away in some little
yeah.
pocket of my brain where I'm never going to have to look at it. And I think that as a community and as individuals, instead of really coping, we didn't.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think and I can't speak for everyone, but in general, I don't think people grieved. I think people just
Avoided.
figured out how to become numb to it.
Yeah.
And you sort of go into this like autopilot mode, which is not healthy, but you don't want to be the only person in this town who is affected. And if
Yeah.
no one else is saying it out loud and no one else is showing that they're affected, then, you don't want to be that guy. So
Yeah.
I think afterward, everyone put on the smiling faces and said, we are stronger as a community. And
Mhm.
maybe that was the case for some people, just not the people I knew.
Yeah.
But in general, I was so confused by that because everyone was so like, we're strong and we're wonderful and we're so great. And like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
No, we're not. We're really, hanging on by a thread, or at least I am. So if you're not, then like, I want to know what drug you're taking, because it, I
Yeah.
really, I don't think that happened. And I think in small town, rural America, the expectation is not that you go to therapy. Maybe you go to church, but
Yeah.
otherwise, like, there isn't a resource for you to go to really.
Yeah.
So you just figure out how to stuff it away. And that does some weird stuff to stuff that away for 15 years and for a lot of people, indefinitely.
Yeah. That's a lot. So this shooter, you mentioned homeless guy. Why your town? What drew him to you all?
We still don't know. I don't think that there really is
Okay.
a particular reason, or at least not to my knowledge. The suicide note that he wrote, I read it when I was doing the research for this project, and the like return address was actually near my current home in Denver.
Hmm.
So he was local. He was a Colorado resident, but I don't, as far as anybody knows, there was no rhyme or reason. I don't think he like had a vendetta against our town. I don't think he had a vendetta against these particular students. I think he was just severely, severely mentally ill, had nowhere to turn, and this is the desperate thing he chose to do. I
Hmm.
believe he was a hunter and he liked to like camp and spend time in the woods. So
Okay.
that might have explained why he was
Yeah.
like camping out in the middle of nowhere. But otherwise, I really, I think afterward a lot of people wanted there to be a reason, just to make sense of everything.
Right.
But I don't think there was. I think this was one of those just like weird things where somebody, their mind wasn't right and they did something that was irrational. And
Hmm.
you can't rationalize something that is irrational.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's almost scarier because you always tend to hear about it from it's a big town problem, it's a big city problem,
Right.
and then you hear about these small rural towns in the middle of nowhere as you describe, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
why? Like, why? That's very random. It's
Yeah,
not like it's a huge city that has a lot of people that are upsetting a lot of people, the
totally.
politicians and the stuff.
Yeah, not a lot of like crime or
Yeah.
anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, you're right. It's really off-putting and unsettling to think that like it can happen anywhere. Like,
Yeah.
and I don't know, seems like an awful thought because then it feels like you're never really safe.
Right.
Um, but unfortunately, like we have a problem to solve in our
Yeah.
country, and that it doesn't matter what political side of the aisle you're on. There is not a person who wants mentally ill violent people to have a gun in their hand. i
Right.
i don't I grew up in a family of hunters. We had guns in our home,
Right.
and still my extended family who are gun owners do not believe we should give guns to people who have severe mental illness and are violent.
Hmm.
And as long as that continues to be the case,
Right.
like how can we expect things to change?
Right. It's true. So you're doing this podcast. You are trying to kind of hyper focus on a little bit of the recovery afterwards and what these
Mhm.
Syrians are experiencing. So, what does this continue looking like for you as you continue developing more information? Is it just going from a whole bunch of different people's stories, or how are you going to approach it?
So it's going to continue to be focused on the four main characters. So that
Okay.
is a character loosely based on myself, my
Hmm.
mom, my dad, and my brother. Because when it happens. That is 15 years ago. Our lives looked very different.
Right.
And so each season covers about a year and a half
Okay.
ish. So as the seasons go, you'll watch the characters evolve and grow and change and go to, and go to school, go to new cities, have new experiences. And all the it as it grows, it won't continue to be as depressing as it currently is.
Right. You're in the
Because
beginning.
yeah, like as you
Yeah.
get further away from the event itself, it affects you less, but it doesn't stop affecting you.
Mhm.
So I one of the inspirations for the podcast actually was a different podcast in which it's a podcast called The Daily, and the interviewers had talked to these young women who had survived the Parkland shooting in Florida, and they
Hmm.
were 15 years old.
Yeah.
And I heard their interview, and they sounded so young, which was like jarring to me, because
Yeah.
I think of 15 as being a grown up, because when it happened to me I was like, now I'm a grown up. But I heard these young women who sound like children, and I'm like, oh god, that was how old I was. That is so crazy. And
Mhm.
anyway, the questions they were asking were about, like, what is my life going to look like when I'm 20? What's my life going to look like when I'm 30? Like, what am I ever going to feel normal again? Ever?
Right.
And when I heard this interview, I thought, like, I know the answers to that question. I can help shed light on that particular topic, because now I am 30. It has been 15 years. I can tell you what year one looks like. I can tell you what year two looks like. I can I
Hmm.
can share with you my own journey,
Yeah.
and hopefully that will help some other people who've been through, any sort of trauma. It doesn't have to be this one. I
Right.
think any person who's gone through something difficult has had to figure out how to move forward.
Hmm.
And so anyway, that this this podcast that I've created called Forward is sort of an answer to their questions as to, will you ever feel normal again? And the answer is yes and no.
Yeah.
It's not that simple. It's not going to look pretty some of the time, a decent amount of the time, but
Yeah.
eventually it will fade. It will be less troubling than it once was, and that takes a lot of hard work and a lot of therapy
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned the there was one that passed away, and I know that was mentioned in your podcast thing, I think, as well. Um have you talked to her family to see like what experiences they have had in your research? Are they still functional?
I have exchanged very briefly an email with her family just to kind of discuss basically what it is that I'm doing.
Yeah.
But I intentionally made a point that this podcast was not going to be about her story
Right.
for a few reasons. One, her family has suffered so greatly because they
Mhm.
lost a child, which is, so horrible.
Right.
And I felt like this is not the time and space for me to um, try and reopen that wound or
Mhm.
do something that invades their privacy in any way. And so, really, I've tried as much as possible to veer away from that particular plot point,
Yeah.
because, in my mind, although that is an extremely, extremely important part of the story, and it's very sad, there's this much larger conversation that nobody has in the United States about everybody else. And I think we tend to invest of all of our energy and our thinking about that particular family, which
Mhm.
is obviously, I understand why that
Yeah.
that makes
Yeah. Yeah.
perfect sense.
Right.
And at the same time, I don't think people are even aware of the fact that there's this ripple effect that goes beyond just that family.
Mhm.
It affects every child who is in that building, every teacher that was in that building, every parent of every child in that building, every coach, every employer, every grandmother, every grandfather, every, like,
Right.
there's within any amount of degrees of separation, this sort of situation, it touches everybody. And
Yeah.
and as we in our beginning of our conversation, like, I don't know whether or not you've experienced a situation with gun violence, and yet both of us have a fear when we walk into a movie theater.
Mhm.
It has a ripple effect that goes beyond just the just who's in that room.
Right.
And I think that that is the story that I really wanted to tell, because the news coverage always really spends a lot of time and energy on who is it, the person that we lost, and we don't talk about all of the other people who are affected. And that is the story that I was like, somebody needs to tell this, because I don't think people are even aware of the long-term effects on a much larger community.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and something like that, it's similar to a mental type of abuse, because in mental abuse, which is my background, I was part of some major narcissistic trauma.
Mm,
And what you bury in here and don't let out creates some very dark holes, rabbit
right,
holes that you end up
right.
in some weird times.
Yes,
And so,
exactly,
not that
exactly.
I'm comparing gun violence and that to this, except for it wasn't physical abuse. It is very much internalized
Mm-hmm.
mental strain. And
Exactly.
I understand that part of this, not what you
Exactly. Well, you
experienced.
understand trauma. And I
Right.
think that,
Yeah.
trauma is universal. And I
Okay.
think when I started on this project, I was like, no one's going to understand this because it's such a specific story. And
Yeah.
I've realized that that's not been the case at
Mhm.
all,
Right.
because everyone has experienced some sort of trauma that left a long-term mark on them as a person. And I think anyone can understand that. You
Right.
understand that.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't just go away. It's not like you're like, well, that happened last year, so now I'm
Yeah.
fine. I'm
No.
sure that your
You get
story
triggered by random.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not as simple as like, well, I'm just over that. That's
Right.
not how it works. It's not how the brain works.
Yeah. But it's funny. I told my counselor, that's what started this podcast for me, is I told my counselor a little over 4 years ago, when I was getting out of my situation, I want to help people. And she's like, "You're not ready." I'm like, "No, I think I'm good." I am now 4+ years removed. And if I look back, I'm like, "Oh, I wasn't good."
Interesting. Do you think that the podcast was helpful though? Like, were you ready in that way or no?
Yeah. So for me, I just really had this. I wanted to help other women that were in the situation I was in try to get out faster than I did, because I was in for like
I
11
see.
years.
Yeah.
And I feel like if I look back on my situation, there were probably 4 or 5 very specific instances that I saw the true evil of what was happening in my situation,
Mm,
but I justified it away
as
versus
you
like getting
do.
out.
Yep, yep,
And
yep.
so, back then, I just wanted to help women get out faster than I did. Like, that was my only
Oh,
thing. So I did not do the podcast back then. My counselor's like, "You're not ready to help people. Like,
okay.
you can't do this." I just started this podcast in November of 2020. And
Oh,
that's
okay. Uh-huh.
because during COVID, I was having conversations with people that were stuck in a worse situation because they're now staying at home with
Oh
their abuser. They
gosh.
weren't getting to go to work to get away from it for a while or
Mm,
whatever.
that's
And
terrifying.
yeah, so I said, "Okay, I'm going to start this." It's time, because I was hearing stories. But then I had other people come forward and said, "It's not just abuse. Like, you should be talking about whatever ails people right now, to bring them
Mhm.
some hope that there's a positivity on the end of the situation. It does get better. It does get easier. It hurts
Mhm.
now, but and
Yeah.
so my best friend, one of the very first people that said, "I'm in," I interviewed him on living with HIV. And
Mm.
it wasn't even about my story. I didn't even start with my story.
Mhm.
I was like, "Let's do this." And we just jumped right in. But looking back, I realized even 4+ years how much I mentally have changed in learning to cope and letting those triggers affect me for a minute and then figuring it out and moving on. And there's still
Right.
triggers that I know are buried somewhere and will surface at some point. Um, but if I would have thought back to 4+ years ago, when I thought, "I'm fine, I can do this, I'm good," I was not. Like,
Totally. And
not.
it's a journey and it's not
Yeah.
linear. You'll have
Yeah.
moments where it's like, "Oh, I'm doing great." And
Yeah.
then you'll realize the next day like, "No, I'm not."
Yeah. It's a thing.
But I think what you're just referring to is so important, that Like, okay, you'll have something trigger you, but you're learning the coping mechanisms so that that trigger doesn't have to completely derail you.
Right.
The trigger's still going to be there. It probably won't ever go away 100%, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn strategies that help you learn a life that, or live a life that feels healthy for you.
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah.
that's it. I think people don't even know that that's an option. And like in the podcast, I talk about how I was having panic attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And oh my gosh, I wish I would have known that I could have gone to a therapist years before I actually did, that
Right.
could have helped me figure out how, okay, when something triggers you and you start having a panic attack, this is how you make it stop or at least slow down. Because it's
Right.
not reasonable to be like trying to live your life that way, that things like trigger you and you feel awful all the time.
Right.
Like there's
Yeah.
another way to live. And it sounds like you've been doing your work so that you can learn
Yeah.
how to make it a little bit easier. Life is hard at the end of the day. If there's some
Very.
stuff you can learn to make it, you know, less difficult,
Yes.
it's worth doing, I think.
I went to a counselor because someone said, just go talk to someone. It'll just ease some of the burden. And I realized how screwed up I truly was. I didn't trust myself. I couldn't make a solid decision. I didn't
Mm,
like, you could have told me the sky was blue and I would have questioned if that was right. Because when I came out,
mm,
my self esteem and my confidence was just done. And
right.
so I tell people I went to a counselor to start figuring myself out. Well, then you always get that, which is why people don't go to counselors. Oh, you must have a problem. You're going to a therapist. Oh,
Right. There's like a taboo around it, which is so annoying.
it is so annoying. And my response to people is, you have no idea the problems I would have if I never went to my therapist.
Exactly. That's
So,
the thing. At the end of the day, people who go to therapists are much healthier human beings than people who
100%.
choose not to go to a therapist. I don't know. It's so
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah, but you don't
100%.
you don't always get that in the moment, and then later you're like, "Oh."
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is
Well,
like the cool thing about both of our podcasts is that we're having these conversations out loud and hopefully removing some of the stigma,
right.
because it really is a
Mhm.
wonderful healthy choice to go to therapy.
Yes. Yeah, I actually interviewed a hypnotherapist, and I wanted to give a different perspective on like there's ways to heal outside of just counseling.
Mhm.
There's all kinds of ways, and she does what she calls talk therapy. She has a therapist because she said sometimes I have to take care of my mental well being if I can do hypnotherapy on my clients. If my mental place is
Totally.
not centered, like I can't do them the service that they need.
Have you ever
And
done hypnotherapy?
I have not.
I haven't either, but
Um,
I'd like to try it. It seems
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. She was fascinating. She gave a variety of so many things I wouldn't have even thought she could help with. Between you always hear like, go to one to quit smoking or lose weight or, addiction type things. She talks about how you peel back the layers in hypnotherapy to expose the triggers before you're triggered, or
Oh.
people
Oh.
who have negative attachments to like their parents or grandparents because of childhood trauma, and how you can peel those layers back to expose the problem is, as a child you don't have they're there but you don't actually recall all the memories that are there, but you
Mm,
have this distance with one of your family members and you're like, I just don't understand why I don't feel good with that person. She
mhm.
can slowly peel the layers back through the hypnotherapy process to expose the situation of why you have a problem with that person. So then you can go to that person and say, "Okay, so I'm realizing why I don't feel good around you and let's talk this out. Let's either fix this or we just cannot be in the room together," type of thing.
That's fascinating.
Super
Psychology is
fascinating.
so cool.
Super fascinating. It was like I had no idea. No idea.
I'm
So
gonna
I
go
was
back and
super
listen to
glad I
that
brought her
episode.
on. Yeah. It's fascinating. I just determined that through this process, therapy is not a one size fits all. The way of healing is not
Yes.
a one size fits all, and everybody
Okay.
approaches it very differently. Um, some seek out the church thing, like the small town. That's where you go to your pastor and you
Totally. And
talk
there's
it
nothing
out.
wrong with that if that's
Right.
what is your medicine. You just have to figure out
Right.
what that is.
Exactly. So, on the other end of that, some people self-medicate and do things a
Right.
little the wrong direction, and that
Yeah.
can't be good either.
No,
So,
definitely
yeah.
not.
So it's been good.
Mhm.
I'm glad I opted to go this route with my podcast. I'm glad I waited. I'm in a healthier place now and can confidently do an interview without having those strange emotions arise that create something that shouldn't be publicly out
Right.
there, maybe. Um,
Totally. Yeah.
so yeah, yeah, it's good.
Well, that's
Well,
cool.
so tell us, you're in season 1 right now.
Mhm.
So, how many episodes will be in this? Because I think you only have so many right now, right?
Yep, there's only 11 episodes in season 1,
Okay.
and, we're going to release the next one on Friday, so, yeah, we've been releasing them once a week, so by the
Okay.
time that this interview airs, likely they'll all be out in the
Right.
world, so
Yeah.
if you're the kind of person like me who likes to binge, TV or podcast or whatever,
Mhm.
they'll all be out there for your viewing pleasure, and you can
Okay.
find them, wherever you want. We have a website, forwardpodcast.com.
Okay.
Forward is spelled funny. It's FOREWARD. It's a combination of the word forward, like the forward of a book, and
Yeah.
like forward, like moving forward. So it's a
Okay.
made up word. But anyway, FOREWARD. We have
Okay.
a Twitter, we have an Instagram, we have a Reddit, so we have a Facebook. You can find us wherever your heart desires.
Okay. And we'll link all of those to the description of this interview as well, so people can just easily click. It'll simplify their process.
Perfect.
So if
That
you're
sounds
watching this
good.
or listening to this right now, you can go to the description and access all of the things that she just talked about in order to get to where her information is at. And it's really not just your everyday podcast, it very much is a unique thing. I guess a last question I have on your podcast itself is, why did you choose to go so fictional? Um, you mentioned it's a fictional story based off of your experience, so it is based off of true life, however you do it. Why did you choose to go that route?
Um, so most of the stories are true, to be
Mhm.
honest with you. Um, in order to tell a story in an episodic way, like a television series,
Mhm.
you have to condense time.
Okay.
So in an episode, maybe that's supposed to be a day and a half. Well, maybe there's 3 months worth of events that happen in a day and a half because it makes the story more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
yeah.
although the stories are all true, they're likely smashed into a smaller package, so that
Okay.
requires some amount of fictionalization just to make it make sense as a
Got it.
unit.
Okay.
And some in an audio drama, you're just hearing the characters speak, and
Mhm.
so you're recognizing their voices, but you can only have so many characters or it gets very confusing because
Yeah.
you can't see them. And so a lot of the characters, probably most of the characters, are a combination of more than one real person.
Mhm.
So, for instance, the lady who's the town gossip is a combination of 3 different women that I knew from my small hometown. Wow,
Got
that
it.
was a weird sentence. Uh,
Yeah.
anyway, so the stories in general
Yeah.
are true.
Right.
The people in general are based on real people,
Yeah.
but in order to condense it and make it into a neat, tidy 11 episode series,
Yeah.
it became necessary to combine some of the storylines and to protect people's anonymity. You don't want
Right.
to give them their real name and make it
Yeah.
exactly identical to the real person because maybe they don't want the world to know something that I shared in the podcast.
Right.
Um, but yeah, the story is based on a true event.
Mhm.
And yeah, most of what you're going to hear is something that I'm repeating from something I saw or something I heard during those years of living in that small town.
Yeah. So, for anyone that is going to listen or watch, she does put a um, disclaimer or warning on, I think, two of the episodes kind of early on, which are more about the shooting part of it itself, or that part of the book part of that story right there. And she does tell you, if you've had some sort of trauma in this way, you may not want to watch it. So I just want to throw that out there for anyone that maybe has some sensitivities. Um, make sure you read the warnings on the description before you listen to those episodes.
And some
Um,
people are choosing to just skip those episodes, which
and
is
that's
perfectly
yeah,
fine. So
right.
episodes 1 and 2 kind of introduce you to the town and to the characters.
Yes.
Episodes 3 and 4 are the shooting, and then the rest of the season is all about the aftermath. So if that's not your cup of tea, that is absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to skip those.
Yeah. I just noticed in looking through the descriptions that you kind
Yep.
of disclaimered those kind of sections,
Hmm.
which I thought was very smart. Not
Yeah, 'cause
everybody's
I
ready
mean,
for that.
it is hard to listen to, and for
Yeah.
me, it's extremely hard to listen to, and I made it, so I can only
Yeah.
imagine for someone who hasn't been prepped,
Yeah.
if you have been through a situation with gun violence, it would be really, really hard to listen to, and
Mhm.
if that's not part of your healing process, then I would urge you to consider just skipping those. It's not gonna be
Okay.
everybody's cup of tea. That's okay.
Yeah. So, with that being said, have you been re-triggered or has it brought some new emotions putting this thing together?
For sure. Yeah, it's been an extremely emotional process
Yeah.
to create this thing, from writing all the different characters to directing actors to feel emotions that I once felt.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's been a doozy.
Yeah.
But honestly, it's been the most useful therapy that I've ever done, because it did require me to go really deep into the nitty-gritty of every single detail. You know, you
Yeah.
can't just tell people the Cliff Notes version of the story. You tell people about everything when you're making an audio drama.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's been helpful, but I think, it was time. It was
Yes.
time that I finally look this thing in the eye and talk about it and say it out loud, and that's what we've done here.
I think it's awesome. Any
Me
last
too.
advice for any of our viewers?
I don't think so. I think they should just keep listening to your podcast and hearing
Oh,
about all the different ways that
I
we
agree
can
with that.
that we can be better. I think that's a good message that you're sending out into the world, that,
I agree with
you
that.
know, yeah, that there's light at the end of the tunnel.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody who is listening to this podcast or watching this video now. Please make sure you check out Forward. It is incredible. I've only watched or listened to 2 episodes. I told her about that before we started taping, but it is definitely on my podcast thing to continue checking it out. It is intense, but totally relatable, and I think it's amazing. So we will definitely put all of those things in the description of this video. So if you're interested in checking it out, please just go to where we describe what this video is about. The link will be there. You can click on it and go check out her podcast. She is doing something intense, a lot of editing, a lot of stuff. So definitely like it, subscribe to it while you're there as well. She would probably really love that.
I would. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Shauna.
Um, I wanna thank you, Taylor, for joining us and sharing your story. I know that can be emotional, and I just appreciate you throwing it out here. The whole point of what I'm doing is to try to help people relate, and that every situation can be relatable even if you aren't involved. If you've had trauma like we did in this, it is relatable. So, thank you for coming on. Everybody who's watching, please don't, forget to like this video after you are done, subscribe to our channel, and we will see you all next time. Bye.
Bye.